Everyone. It's Esmee. I am hosting this episode of the Medusa Rising podcast. And my guest this morning here, afternoon there, is Jane Clare Jones. And I'm going to give Jane a little bit of time to introduce herself. And then we're going to do a little table setting, and then we'll just let it rip. So Jane, let everyone know who you are a little bit.
Hello, my name is Jane. I always find it a bit awkward doing these crazy yourself in a few sentences thing. I am a feminist philosopher and a feminist writer and a kind of online activist. I've recently been quite involved in the gender critical fight in the United Kingdom. I also have a specific kind of activist interest in male violence against women and sexual violence and the mechanisms which are responsible for generating that. I write essays. I run a school called the Centre for Feminist Thought, where we teach some introductory feminism courses on second wave feminism and third wave feminism. And we also do a kind of deeper dive course on male dominance, which I think actually some of those issues we'll be touching on today. It's a lot to do with entitlement and narcissism and narcissistic rage and these kinds of issues. And I currently am writing a Substack called Culture War Blues, which kind of is trying to unpick the mechanism between left-wing identitarianism, left-wing identitarianism, and sort of progressive identitarianism and right-wing reactionary identitarianism, and how they are kind of mirror images of one patriarchal mechanism that feminism needs to kind of critique and resist without kind of getting pulled into one or either tribe, which they seem to want to push everyone into one or either tribe, and not particularly down with that.
We're supposed to join one of the tribes and then be of service to one of those tribes. That's what we're supposed to be doing. But we're not. I think that's excellent. I think the one thing we need to let the audience know, just in case they don't know, is that you and I worked together with another group of brilliant women on the Radical Notion together. And
I missed the radical.
You missed the Radical Notion. We spent 4 years making a fantastic fucking magazine.
Yes. Sorry. I don't know. I was trying not to like whiffle on too long. Yes.
Yeah,
we did. And we did spend 4 years making a really lovely, beautiful magazine, actually, under quite trying circumstances, all in all. But we did it.
Yeah. I'm going to let you know your video is kind of slowing down and glitching a little bit sometimes. So I'm just going to ask that we all have some patience with maybe the sound, but we're going to be fine. It's not breaking up so badly that we can't understand you. Okay. And yeah, we'll just, for the two of us, we'll try to speak even a little slower, maybe.
Yeah.
So let me do a little table setting, because I think certainly the United States is in a very interesting, precarious new position. And the UK we've been wrestling with opposite sides of these issues just lately, with these questions of entitlement and narcissism and authoritarianism. And what's come to a real parallel, which you mentioned when we were talking before we started to record, is that we both have really self-involved groups of people very angry at court systems for not giving them what they want.
Yeah.
So there's, in Trump's case here in the United States, where we've gone pretty far already down the autocratic road, Trump wants the power to deport whomever, basically whenever, and the power to identify, on the UK side, the power to identify into another demographic's social position, safer intimate spaces or public provisions. So on one hand, one group of people is trying to dominate one kind of minoritized group before it gets around to all the others. And on the other side of the pond where you are, there's this ongoing struggle over the position of trans women in society, in law, how that affects women, what that means for things like single sex provision in rape crisis shelters, for instance.
Right.
And these two forces are having a kind of warping effect on what democracy might need to be in order to work right.
Right.
So, yeah. So for democracy to be what it's supposed to be, it means that it should create service and support for the people. And both of these groups, sort of MAGA, Trump, and a rather wide swath of the trans community, want to move that to service for more one person or one group of people. Does that make sense?
I mean, I think if you place it in terms of like vulnerability or not, it gets confusing because then you immediately get into competing rights claims.
Mhm.
And to what extent those competing rights claims are true. The Trump backlash is being done against minoritized groups, but from a position of aggrievement, right?
Yeah.
The white straight men consider that they have been marginalized by policies that are designed to focus or level the playing field to some degree for some minoritized communities, right? So the anti-woke backlash is coming from a different place than what is going on with the trans rights movement. But in both cases, there is a determination that the courts are not playing ball with their particular political program, however we understand that political program, and how we might want to understand it. Obviously, the trans rights movement would repudiate any claim that there is any similarity between their political program and Trumpian politics, insofar as they claim to be the voice of the marginalized and the oppressed. And Trumpian politics is clearly a politics that is functioning in the interests of the reassertion of a kind of white male status quo. The issue in both cases is that both cases have a radical political program that is not supported by the law. And they are attempting to basically enforce their political program in defiance of the law and obviate kind of legal and democratic processes that are there in order to provide safeguards against tyranny, which is quite important, right? I'm not an idiot. I don't think liberal democracy is a perfect system. I don't think law is perfect. I think law can be unjust, and it clearly operates very often in the interests of the powerful. But it is the best safeguard that we have against tyranny. I'm very for avoiding tyranny. And if that means we have to engage in these somewhat laborious democratic processes that don't always get us what we want, then so be it. Because we need some guarantee as a society that there are mechanisms which we all have to abide by which we come to social consensuses about how we do things. Otherwise, it's just force, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise,
Yeah.
it's just the exercise of force. And
Yes.
so, the trans rights movement would say, well, Trump is wrong to deport these Venezuelan citizens, well, Venezuelan residents or whatever their legal status is. And my understanding is that most of them have legal status to some degree or another under immigration law, and that their deportation is a violation of immigration law. For one thing, and then as far as I understand it, the Supreme Court has said that various individuals that have been wrongly deported have to be returned, and Trump has just ignored it. And in a similar vein, the British Supreme Court, United Kingdom Supreme Court, just ruled on the meaning of sex in the Equality Act. And it does need to be pointed out that what was ruled on was not actually trans rights. What was ruled on was the definition of woman, right? And the fact that this is interpreted or is understood or is something that was needed to be done in response to the Trans Rights Project is because the Trans Rights Project attempted to illicitly redefine women in law in a covert manner, essentially, in an anti-democratic manner that obviated the normal processes of democratic discussion and legislation. And so we had to get the law clarified in order to make it clear that women exist, female people exist as a class in law, and that we have access to single-sex spaces that are given to us by the law. And if the trans rights movement wants that situation to be changed, then it needs to go through the correct democratic process, which is it needs to go to the legislature and ask for the law to be changed, rather than attempting to covertly change the law in a manner that women think is undermining of women's interests. And if we have two different groups in society that have different needs or objectives, then in a democratic process, that needs to be negotiated in a transparent way, right? And so there is a similarity, not necessarily in the political rhetoric, even though there is in both cases actually an appeal to kind of politics of grievance, right? Which I don't necessarily object to, right? People have reason to feel aggrieved, and sometimes it's because they have been subject to injustice, right? The question is that injustice real or is it manufactured? And that is also another reason why we need to have an open democratic conversation, so that as a society we can decide whether these claims that injustice has been done are actually, whether we agree with them, and then collectively come to some kind of determination about the nature of this injustice and how it needs to be ameliorated, right? Claiming that you are being subject to injustice because there are policies in order to level playing fields which have previously discriminated against African Americans or women is quite different from claiming that an injustice is being done against you because women want female-only rape crisis centres, right? I don't think those are equivalent claims. And we should... so, you know, I don't want to use this kind of right-wing populist, oh, it's grievance politics, and dismiss it all, because some grievances are well-founded and should be addressed, right?
Mm-hmm.
They should be
Yeah.
addressed in the democratic process, not by declaring that your grievance gives you a right to obviate normal legal procedures, which is what trans
Right.
rights is claiming. We are oppressed, we are aggrieved, we are being harmed, therefore we have a right to covertly redefine you in law and take your resources. And I'm like, no.
Mm-hmm. That's where the
And
sort of secret overlap is.
yes, that and because there's a kind of reality denial. There's an authoritarian desire to assert one's needs, and to do so by twisting the nature of reality in order to present oneself in one way and dismiss one's critics in
Mm-hmm.
ways that are not grounded, not faithful representations of what's actually happening, and not grounded in reality, right? And if you're so confident in the justice of your claim, then go through the democratic processes and allow us as a society to adjudicate on the justice of your claim. Then your claim
Right.
will be legitimate. That's how we do it,
The
right?
dem process wants
It's a democratic
to
process.
mitigate, but it mitigates against the tyrannical desires of a narcissistic personality or a narcissistic social formation, right? It's the
And
self, the need that drives all of that, right? A king or a divine class of people. That narcissism is actually part of, it's actually rewarded by being domineering in a domination structure, right?
yeah, no,
So,
absolutely, right? And deciding that justice is precisely the same thing as me getting what I want
mhm,
is a fundamentally narcissistic assumption, right? So what the trans I mean, like what Trump will do is that any piece of reality that impinges on his narrative will just be dismissed as fake news, right? Or leftist propaganda, right? The trans rights movement do exactly the same thing. Any piece of reality that impinges on their narrative is dismissed as illegitimate or bigotry or conservatism or right-wing propaganda. So you have exactly the same kind of tribal narcissistic structure. Anything that comes in from outside that challenges my reality and my goodness will be dismissed. And like you see very clearly in that the relationship between the kind of narcissistic structure and the structure of domination, and also the structure of kind of tribal identitarianism, right? They're all part of the structure. I am right. My worldview is correct. My understanding of reality is correct. Anything that challenges that can then be othered and dismissed without having to be taken on, processed, argued with, responded to as if it has any merit. And then what you end up with is these increasingly kind of hermetically sealed tribal worldviews that are now just kind of ping-ponging off each other and reinforcing each other. So the extremism of the kind of woke identitarian position is feeding the backlash of the right-wing populist MAGA position, which is then feeding a kind of entrenchment in the left identitarian position. And they keep going backwards and forwards.
Yeah.
And then what it means is that the majority of people in the world who, if we take the trans issue, the majority of people in the world understand that humans come in two sexes and that this is not completely insignificant. And they also don't like fascists, right?
Mm.
And at the moment, we're basically being presented with this like binary choice between sex denial or fascism, which is insane.
Right.
If the left thinks that a good anti-fascist, and the left seems to have decided that the best anti-fascist strategy is to go and make everyone that knows that mammals come in two sexes to go and stand with the fascists, which is completely fucking barking. The best way to defeat fascism is to put all the people who know that humans are sexed on the side of the fascists. Well, excellent work. You're gonna
be massively outnumbered.
definitely
It's
gonna
not
be
going to work in your
outnumbered.
favor in a lot of people. Yeah,
Maybe
and
you
it's
could let
going
all
to
the
trample. Sorry, they're
no,
both either direction. They're both going to trample over women, right? This is the other sort of important parallel that struck me when I was thinking about this, is that they both demand access to women as supports for their projects or their sense of self, right? So Trump's policies here, if you add them all up, create a kind of enclosure for women, right? We're not necessarily going to remove rights or change law. We're going to make it impossible for you to access those rights by denying access to abortion, by eliminating all of these DEI policies, by firing a lot of women from government positions, from high-level leadership in the military, etc. We're going to cut the social safety net in various ways that are still unclear, but obviously they're going to take a good whack at Medicare and Medicaid.
right.
They're cutting off, I'm just going to go down the list. They're cutting off support for special needs children in terms of education and social supports. They're zeroing out, they have zeroed out completely all of the government grants for domestic violence and sexual assault support that did like training of police forces or lawyers or medical professionals, and some of which directly supported shelters. You used to be able to see this list by state. And it was a huge amount of money. I was really surprised to learn how much money it was because I had never tracked it down before. It was $633 million last year.
Wow.
And this year, the page where these grants might be described went blank.
I have seen
because
quite a lot of the pages of government websites seem to just be disappearing.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, you go look for an answer to a question like the American Bar Association says, we couldn't do our training. We found out 10 minutes before we were going to do it that the funding had been pulled and we had to stop, right? Like right away. So I went to go look at the part of the website they were claiming, it's the Office for Violence Against Women, which is under the Department of Justice, which is pretty thoroughly captured by Trump at this point. And the numbers were there for years going back, and 2025 was empty. You could find out what the government was doing with almost all of your money just by going to the website and looking around for the answer. So that's gone, right? But he wants to offer American women $5,000 to have a baby. So it's this enclosure. It doesn't matter, that the EPA is going to stop testing for poisons in our food. Like, women are going to have to move into positions of supporting people just to keep the people they care about alive. And this is one of the fundamental first gestures of patriarchy, right? Take women's love for their children and their families and concern for their community and weaponize it against them to keep them out of the public sphere as much as possible, right? Turn them into a resource, as we've talked about in the Radical Notion.
Yeah, and also because they fundamentally think that that is our position, that our position is to be a resource, and that it was, we are there to maintain the social fabric through doing, reproductive and emotional and sexual labor for men.
Right.
And that this is kind of how it feeds, like, ratchets back into the Butlerian position. In the Trumpian position, it is a part of the natural order that women are a resource, right? And that is naturalized in relationship to, kind of generally theological concepts, which still have a large hold on the American political imagination in a way that's quite fundamentally different to Europe, because Europe is much more deeply secular than the United States. And that's how you get the production of the kind of Butlerian position, by inversion, because in Butler's mind, nature, any kind of appeal to nature, has this kind of religious, natural law, the natural order of things, woman's natural role kind of implication. Like, she cannot seem to think sex biology without, the concept of nature in reference to evolution and the concept of nature in reference to religion are not the same concept of nature. But that's not clear to her, right? And so the conflict that is happening in the United Kingdom in relationship to trans rights came from a background of secular materialist feminism, not from a religious, we need to maintain the natural order and keep women in the home place. The cultural differences in the two countries are quite important in order to understand the differences in the way in which the conflicts have played out. That is not at all clear to people like Butler, or the people who are looking at the British situation from the American position, but who are not like you, because you've actually been quite closely involved in the British situation, so you've seen how it's played out, right? But Butler eventually just kind of peers at us across the Atlantic and then turns up once every year and tells us that we're all Pope, and then goes away.
Yeah.
And we're just like, I don't know who, like, it's, I don't know who you're addressing, but like none of us are the Pope.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think it's a little more, because there's a sort of religious sense of what nature means in the US, and that's driving some of this Trumpian reassertion of a classical male supremacist order,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. What's happening, for instance, in some of these executive orders that he's published about regarding gender or the status of transgender people have been really punitive.
Yeah.
They've been worded in an incredibly aggressive, vicious kind of way. When they're trying to be honest and clear, they're doing it in the harshest term possible. So there's one executive order protecting children from chemical and surgical mutilation, it's called. It does some smart things. It insists on some investigations of, like, the medical industrial complex and how it's sort of going into gender affirming care and gender transition, partly because there's so much money to be made there, right? It's very expensive to enter into the process of transition. And if anything goes wrong, you're a permanent patient, right? You are a permanent source of income for that industry. So they've got a lot of motivation to continue telling people that this is a kind of care that they need, even if it's a distraction. But it offloads a lot of the burden to individuals almost immediately, because it insists that any programs that are sort of tangentially even attached to the federal government, its programs or its funding, must stop. For instance, any hormonal treatments that are being given to people who are underage, right?
Yeah,
Just
and
stop.
this
And
is
so
the
that pull-up is damaging,
you couldn't. Yeah, and I mean it's interesting. I was shaking my head because mutilation is not a word that you should be using in lawmaking because this is political rhetoric,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. It's really inflammatory.
It's now, I'm not going to judge whether people should or should not use this word. I am profoundly aware that detransitioners have repeatedly asked for that word not to be used because it's extremely inflammatory. And they are dealing, it does not help the people who are dealing with the consequences of this surgery to have to hear that kind of inflammatory rhetoric being used about them. So that's my concern with it.
Right.
And it's a bit of a tell, right, about what, about the extent to which the policy making about this in the United States is, again, if you look at the way in which Britain have dealt with this issue, we dealt with it by undertaking a really thorough medical review and then going quite slowly. Now, there are questions with regard to the trial. The recommendation that Cass made that there should then be a trial on puberty blockers, right? And obviously, people have medical concerns about this, but at least what I will say is that that was being done in the spirit of, again, following what I would understand to be a fairly rigorous, open, democratic way of making policy in a democratic society. Okay, people are doing these things. Let's review the evidence. Let's report back on the evidence to government. Then let us undertake further research. Now, whether that further research should be undertaken is questionable because of the nature of the treatments, right? But at least it's the not just we're going to come along, we're going to use, and by fiat, we are now going to cut off all of this treatment and declare it illegitimate without having established a consensus or at least even attempted to engage in a process of careful evidential collection and discussion. Now, the problem is trans activists are not very open to this kind of democratic process, but I don't think that means that we should just, I mean, what we end up with is then two bunches of authoritarians just trying to slug it out, right? And
Yeah.
go and go. And I I think we still should demand that we behave and model the processes that we are trying to defend, right? And one of my main objections to the trans rights movement was that it was going about things in an authoritarian and duplicitous manner. And I do not think the response to a bunch of people doing things in authoritarian, disciplinary, dodgy, sketchy, like duplicitous way is to do things in a authoritarian and sketchy and duplicitous way, but just from the
No matter where you are.
from
Yeah.
the other, from the other side, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's very difficult when you look at the landscape because what we have done in the United Kingdom is we have followed democratic procedures in order to push back against the overreach of the trans rights movement. And we've done it in a very transparent and straightforward manner, right? They are still claiming that we're all trying to murder them. So it doesn't actually make any difference to the outcome But it does make a difference whether what they're saying is true or not. So, like, they have every reason to be frightened about what's happening in the United States, right?
Yeah.
Which is
Yeah.
absolutely true.
Scary.
It's absolutely true that the populist right and the MAGAs are extremely hostile to minorities, and that is what is driving the position. There are two positions. One is a secular materialist and very often feminist, but there are many secular materialists who are against the trans rights project, not from a feminist perspective, but from an empirical or materialist or secular point of view. And then there is a conservative position. We've said this many times, right? There's a feminist critique and there's a gender conservative critique. The backlash in America is coming from gender conservatism. The British movement is still principally, particularly in terms of the organizations that have taken leading roles, is still principally coming from materialist, secular, human rights perspective and a feminist background, right? They're very different projects, actually.
Yeah.
No one who is responsible for the Supreme Court judgment or for pushing through that process is trying to erase trans people from public life. That is not their intention. The Trump administration is. Like, they're fundamentally doing different things.
Yeah. They've another example of how really punitive. I think there's something in the enjoyment of this domination, right? That's going on with the sort of MAGA. I'll just use that as a big collective. Creating this pain, creating this fear is something that they like doing. So
they want revenge.
it's part of what feeds it's part of what the narcissist needs to eat, right? It's
Right.
not enough to be regarded. You must be regarded and feared.
Yeah.
They've shut off the funding for the National Suicide Hotline for trans and queer youth.
Yeah, I mean, that's just unforgivable.
Right?
And there's,
So it's
there's
getting really, it's
absolutely-
really just fact of you. The fact of you is objectionable to them, right? We're just going to let whatever terrible thing can happen to you happen.
Yeah,
and I think
videos of the deportations, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
the cruelty is the point, right? And there's an awful lot of kind of, to come back to this idea of the politics of grievance, right? There's definitely grievance there. But the grievance is about people having had the temerity to challenge the hierarchy of power and the desire to reassert that hierarchy of power with added punishment for people having got out of place, right? Or having refused to stay in their place. Like this American political project has been laid down and developed since the 1980s, right? It is the backlash to the civil rights movement and the women's movement, right? The gender critical project is not the culmination of a 40 or 50-year political project in the United Kingdom to undo the gains of the 60s and 70s. Like, they are not the same political project and they don't have the same history. The gender critical project is actually attempting to preserve the gains of the women's movement of the second wave women's movement. That's very different from the project of the Christian right. But to try and think about, the narcissistic structure the narcissistic structure in the Christian right project is the threat that is felt by the kind of sovereign patriarchal male subject when his dominion over other people is threatened, right? So if we take the patriarchal subject as a subject that is fundamentally unable, I mean, if we think about what we mean by narcissism in relationship to patriarchy, and when we talk patriarchal male subject, what I mean when I say it fundamentally is a kind of relation. There's lots of different interpretations of what we mean by narcissism in the psychoanalytic tradition, right? But what I would mean by it is incapable of dealing with relation or dependence, particularly dependence, like unable to recognize and negotiate with other people as if they are full subjects who are worthy of respect, right? So there is a similarity in a certain sense between liberal equality law and the mitigation of narcissism, right? Because narcissism is, I refuse to recognize the needs of other people, usually people who I'm either dependent on or who my actions are actually affecting, right?
Mhm.
So with the Trans Rights Project, there's been this point blank refusal all the way through for them to recognize that the demands that they are making impact women, and women have a right to resist the impacts of those demands because they consider them to be to undermine their needs. What we have constantly got back from the trans rights movement is like me, 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 me. Like, we need this, we want this, we demand this, and we don't even recognize that you exist or that our demands are having any effect on you. And we're even going to claim that you even saying that our demands are having an effect on you is like evil bigotry that's motivated by hatred, right? So it's not, it's different insofar as the patriarchal project of the kind of MAGA project is about attempting to reclaim some kind of supposedly, it has that classic fascistic structure of like there's a
Yeah.
golden age in the past where white men were king, and then these brown black people and women and homosexuals and various other deviants and foreigners came, and they have undermined the natural order, and that is the reason why there is chaos, right? And so what we need to do is we need to go back to the
Or what?
previous order in which white men were on the top of the tree, right? Now, clearly,
Mhm.
that's not the discursive structure of the trans rights movement, right? The trans rights movement is not, it doesn't have that kind of fascistic golden age narrative, right?
Right.
But it
Right.
does have a kind of messianic salvation narrative, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
We are wretched of the earth, and if we are saved, then all of mankind will be saved. That's the narrative that's underpinning the
Yeah.
trans.
Yes.
So they have constructed themselves as the kind of totem, like the religious totem of the oppressed.
Mm.
And they're like that word that we can never say, synecdoche. No one ever knows how to say that word.
Schenectady. Say it
Is
like
it?
it's a town in New York.
What? Yes. Yeah, it was kind of like, Poughkeepsie. It's like
Right.
12 north of Manhattan on your way to Boston, isn't it? Like,
Mhm. Mhm.
Massapequa Park. Anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, but so the discursive structure that is being used to kind of mobilize the cathexis that is being attached to the narrative is different, right? One of them is a kind of reactionary, kind of classic fascist. Remove the aliens, remove the outside, remove the deviants, and we will return
Yeah.
to the golden age kind of
They're all
narrative.
criminals and rapists.
They're all criminals and perverts and deviants and rapists, and like
Right.
that's why the country has gone to the dogs. And so if we purify the nation, we will return to
Mhm.
gold. Right.
Mhm.
They're like, why are you calling them fascists? And we're like, because this is the platonic form of the fascist narrative. This is how this
Yeah.
works. Right.
Right down to protecting our women, right? Because the EO on gender identity, I'm just going to call it that, is defending women from gender identity ideology.
Right,
Right.
exactly, right. And this is, I mean, if you want to make the TRAs, I mean, this is what's so fucking annoying about the right wing pushback against all the the discursive and narrative form of the right-wing pushback against trans ideology is it just plays right into trans ideology's hands, right? So, for example, all the work that's being done about keeping men out of women's sports. And the TRA narrative is always like, oh, it's because you think women are these frail little white creatures that need big men to protect them and blah, blah, blah. And we're like, no, we just literally think that men are stronger than women and it's just not fair. That, you know, women need protection from discrimination, like all people need protection. All discriminated against groups need protection against discrimination. And interfering with the definition of sex messes up women's legal protections. That's not the same thing as saying, like, leveraging some kind of image of frail white femininity and saying, oh, protect our women from the big marauding,
Right.
like, foreign
Right.
horde, right?
Right.
The discourses can end up getting squished together. There are certain ways of framing the discourse about trans rights that does fall into this kind of sovereigntist frame and then does funnel people into a right-wing pipeline, right? But it's not a necessary feature of asserting the material interests of women as a class. This is why the feminists always put the emphasis very much on the assertion of the material interests of women and not on this, like, keep out the deviant way of people. As soon as you start framing it as like, we must protect women from the deviants, then it does slip very easily into a kind of frame that moves it much more towards the kind of right wing, kind of edging towards fascism kind of frame. Claiming, women have a set of material political interests because they're an oppressed class in a patriarchy, and that's why, when second wave feminist women were lobbying for the Sex Discrimination Act and for the protections that then ended up in the Equality Act in the 1970s, it was nowhere near a right-wing populist discursive frame, right? So unless you actually want to claim that the women who lobbied for the Sex Discrimination Act were fucking proto-fascists, it makes no sense. It makes no sense to say that the Labour government, when they constructed the 2010 Equality Act, were doing it from a position of quasi-fascism. And it's nonsense, right? The protections are there in law because people recognise it's reasonable for women to have those protections. And you do not need to frame it in the way the right-wing populists frame it. But once it slips into protect our women from the foreigner, protect our women from the deviants, protect our women from anyone who is coming from the outside, then that's a very different rhetorical structure and it goes to very different places. And we've seen that in terms of how the politics have played out. Right.
Yeah. I mean, even in that EO, the definition of a woman or a female person is a person who at conception is destined to produce large gametes or something, large reproductive cells. And so the protection is from these strange others that we're going to describe in the most alarming terms, usually well beyond the scope anyone needs to be alarmed about them. But we're going to make sure that in our definition of what female or a woman is, her service, right? Her action as a resource, reproducing literal labor, but also her reproductive labor, then is going to be maintained for us, the good guys in the sort of fascist order, right? The ones who want to have control of those women.
Yeah, that, again, is like a very significant tell about the kind of differences in the political contexts, right?
Yeah.
Like, to a significant degree, I mean, this is one of the things that the Christian right are very well organized and well funded and very smart. And they are very good. I mean, it's very similar to capitalism, right? They are very good at appropriating bits of discourse in order to give themselves cover to make what they're doing look more legitimate, right? That EO was written in 90% feminist discourse. right? If you looked up, I can't remember her name now, the woman who wrote it, she had a clear background in Christian right women's organizations, right, which have a
Mhm.
history using feminist, like the Women's Independence Forum, whatever, of using feminist sounding language in order to propagate anti-feminist objectives. The real tell in that EO was the person at conception thing that
Mhm.
was dropped into it. There is absolutely no fucking reason why that needed to be there in order to clarify the meaning of sex in law, right? Or to push back against the erasure of sex by gender identity. And its function is clearly part of a political program who wants to reposition women as a reproductive resource. Now, the materialist feminist pushback against trans ideology was not about wanting to reposition women as a reproductive resource. It was about objecting to the erasure of the language that we needed in order to critique and describe that structure, right? So again, it's coming from a very different place.
In order to make
Um,
yeah, but that erasure was also meant to serve the feelings and the ego of a certain class of men, right?
yeah,
That's part of the kind of constant. It's not the same level. It's not the same exact structure coming from the same place, but always it boils down to these two discourses and these two directions of working boil down to just making men happy.
yeah, and women, I mean, women being perceived as a resource, right? The Trans Rights Project, in significant respects, is about forcing women to be a resource for male people's identification, right?
Mm-hmm.
Women are required to validate and to give to validate men's identification as women and to give up their services and resources that they need for their own interests. These are not frivolous services. Okay, we can argue about toilets. Toilets are important. But if we're talking about DV services, rape crisis services, women in prison, blah, 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 right?
Mm-hmm.
These are not frivolous indulgences, right? This whole kind of narrative that was used within woke identitarianism more generally, like they're all a bunch of Karens, blah, 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 middle class white women, blah, 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 right? To essentially delegitimize women's position as an oppressed and discriminated against class, to undermine the basis of our resistance against this, what was basically a massive rights grab, right? And in that rights grab, you have the same degree of entitlement, right? My needs matter. Your job is to serve as a resource for my needs. And an absolute unshakable belief that male people's needs should take priority over female people's needs. And female people's job, women's job, is just to get the fuck out of the way and give men what they want. And there is a
One comment,
nice
our
set of assumptions at work.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I can't remember which administration official it was who said it, but they literally said in an interview or a conversation somewhere, anyway, then women should just step aside and let men lead.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the same.
Yeah. And exactly the same language. And David
Get
Tennant
out of the
said
way.
exactly
Yeah.
the same thing. Yes, yesterday, right? Just let people be and get out their way. Well, the problem is, David, is that there's a man in the rape crisis counselling group. So how would you like us to get out the way? Would you like us all to just not go for rape crisis counselling? Which like it doesn't even make sense. Like, we're not actually the ones getting in their way. They are in our space. right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like, we would just like them to not be there because they are preventing the spaces functioning in the way they need to function to meet the needs of the people who the spaces were made for. There is just this absolutely bone deep refusal to understand that women are people and they have their own needs and they are allowed to assert their needs, and you are not allowed to have a fucking tantrum when women, have the temerity to act like they believe that they are like full ass human beings with their own interests.
Yeah.
And, it's the same thing. The fucking massive, like, demographic, you know, they're all very upset because we're not having enough babies. Yeah, well, it turns out that if you don't force women to act as reproductive resources, they choose not to.
Right.
They may have
they choose to
one
have
or
the
two,
children they want and then to pursue other interests. Yeah.
they choose to have the children they want and get on with the rest of their lives. And it turns out that if you allow them to decide how many children they want, they usually don't have more than two. Sometimes they
Mm-hmm.
have three, but left to their own devices. And it's kind of interesting, right? Because historically, in human prehistory, that was about the number of children that women would have had, right? Because we
Yeah.
didn't have it. It was only
Yeah.
after the agricultural revolution, I think you've written about this, but it was only after the agricultural revolution that there was enough food lying around for larger families, right?
Even more
Uh,
than that. It had a lot to do with urbanization and the concentration of populations. Not settlements like in prehistory, but right at the dawn of civilization, you have people gathering into larger and larger defensively structured cities. And over time, but in those very places, the codification of a whole bunch of very complex laws that mostly functioned to contain women. For instance,
right,
in Sumeria, abortion wasn't illegal if a husband demanded it,
right,
but it was an act of treason against the king if a woman had an abortion on her own.
right, and that tells you everything, right?
Right, right.
And this is why abortion, and I think this is why abortion is such a signature issue, right, in the organization of the Christian right, because you can hide it behind a load of bullshit about, like, religious desire to protect the sanctity of life, which is, the most unconvincing, like, a load of bollocks for people who, like, you know, refuse to ensure that, like, poor people have adequate, like, food or medical care, or
Right,
any of the other
right.
basic resources that people need in order to sustain life. But essentially, it's about ensuring that women cannot exercise control over their reproductive capacities and that they are kept in their place as a reproductive resource. It's the fundament of the system. You go for abortion because it is, and that's what was so annoying about the whole fucking trans discourse, right? Because as soon as you start insisting that there's no relationship between sex and the oppression of women, then you can't explain why abortion is such a lightning rod issue and why the desire to remove, like, women's personhood would center so profoundly on attempting to remove their reproductive rights.
And it,
So you end up in this ridiculous situation, or feminists end up in this ridiculous situation where, we've got one set of people who are claiming that we will be dehumanized by recognizing that we're female, and that therefore we have to pretend somehow that our existence and our oppression has got nothing to do with our femaleness. And then on another side, you've got a bunch of people who know that you're female, but believe that that means that you should be turned into a reproductive resource. And I'm like, is there any space for the people who understand that patriarchy functions by turning us into a reproductive resource, but thinks it is a bad idea and wishes to resist it? No, we have to pretend we don't
yeah,
know,
yeah.
or we have to submit. or we have to submit to the system of appropriation. Like, and the other structure in which you want to deny our femaleness means that you want to redefine us as a male projection and think that we have no right to object, and that we then have to decide that our legal existence and our rights and resources, that their primary function is validating men's identity rather than serving women's needs. And I'm just like, this is just the same fucking shit.
Right. You can see,
like a resource.
yeah. I mean, at bottom, that's the demand, right? Because, like,
Oh,
I want to say two things and I'm going to lose track of them. One is that what you see, we'll come back to this. What you see in sort of the MAGA Project 2025 Christian right agenda that is being just sort of rammed down over the United States is what happens when these women are failing to be the thing that I need them to be to serve and to feed my ego, right? My sense of entitlement and where I sit in the world. We're going to just slam that down with all the power of the state now that we have it, right?
right.
And I mean, there's an army behind this, you know. It's not it's not been activated, you know. There are certain fears floating around in the universe about what could happen in terms of policing this country, but the threat's there, the desire is there. And in the UK, on the side of sort of the trans movement, I think culturally but also legally, there's been this, you know, sort of reanimation of the most angry, vicious, borderline violent response to women being just given the space to say, we are not your projection. We are not the source of your image of yourself.
Yeah,
and
there was
both cases, one has an army and the other has the internet.
yeah,
I think that's
but like you say, that the narc rage is actually very simple, right?
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
and the desire to crush, and I mean literally crush, the
Mm.
existence of anything that escapes the kind of narcissistic, that resists the constant desire of the narcissist to compel reality to
Yeah.
fall in line with his projections and his domination, right?
Mhm.
Like, and I mean, I think that's one of the things that's so kind of staggering to me about a trans rights movement is the extent of the sympathy, of the like absolutely bone deep reflexive prioritization of male people's feelings over women is,
Mhm.
and the toleration, and it's the core of the kind of mechanism of male violence, right? They're telling us that they're smashing gender, and then they're telling women that they have to erase themselves in order to center men's needs, and that if men don't get what they want, they're going to have a massive fucking violent tantrum, and then we're all supposed to turn around and go, oh, poor them.
Mm.
And I'm like, all that we did was refuse to erase ourselves. We have not actually taken any given rights from you in law, and I have not set out, and I would not set out to take any given rights from you in law. I do not want you discriminated against in goods and housing and services and these types of things, right? I want you protected from harassment
Right.
and discrimination. I actually want you to be provided with toilet facilities so that you can go to the toilet, right? Without,
Or crisis facilities that are
or facilities that
specifically
you
attuned to your
don't
needs, right?
want services to be taken away from you. I don't want you to be left without provision. I do not want you being threatened, right? What I don't want is males in female spaces because it's
Mm.
inappropriate and it stops those spaces doing what they need to do for women. And my concern, because I'm allowed to center women because that's my job. Like, I'm sorry. And it's not my job to solve your problem, right? And again, there's this patriarchal assumption that's happened in the wake of the Supreme Court, which is like, effectively, oh, now it's somehow our responsibility to solve this problem. And the problem has been created because the trans rights movement tried to get its needs met by taking something from women it was not entitled to and coercively enforcing the appropriation of those resources and rights. And now they've been told no, they're effectively having a massive narc tantrum. And it's just like, and this is you smashing gender, is it? Because this all looks very fucking familiar. And the fact that so many people go along with it, and not only men, right? We can talk about the misogyny of left-wing men until we're blue in the face. I mean, that's why radical feminism came into existence in the first place. Nothing has changed since the late 60s. Like, big surprise. What I find so exhausting is how many women fight with it, right? And don't even realize they're complying. Their absolutely fundamental, bone deep assumption that women as a class should give up their legal rights and protection because there's some men who are sad. And I'm like, I don't wish you to be sad, but I'm not going to erase me and the whole of my class in law because you are sad. And that is not, if this was the other way round, and there were some sad female people asking men to erase themselves as a class and whatever rights and resources they had, nobody would think that was a remotely reasonable request. It would never have got anywhere near getting off the fucking ground. And that is
It
the
certainly wouldn't have its own billionaires behind it.
I mean, this is the fucking set of like structuring gendered assumptions that are, you know, absolutely fundamental. And like you say, men should lead. Men should get what they want. Men should have dominion over. It's the same fucking shit. Even when it's men should have dominion, like men should have dominion over the idea of woman is not a new fucking idea. Right?
Right.
Oh, how
Yeah.
wrong. Like,
Yeah.
we've always known that you thought you had the right to define us. We don't accept your projections as being anything to do with us. We never have done. The fact that a lot of women have such profound internalized misogyny that is caused by them having absorbed patriarchal messages about the inferiority of femaleness is not evidence of the inferiority of femaleness or why we should pretend that women are not female. It's an evidence of how effective patriarchal socialization is.
Well,
Well,
how thoroughly it's woven through everything.
you know, the number of people turn around and go, well, patriarchy, says that women are inferior because of their bodies. Essentially, that is what they're saying when they're saying, oh, you shouldn't reduce women to their biology and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, yeah, okay, so patriarchy says that women are inferior because of their biology. You're not supposed to agree with them. You're supposed to go, no, that's wrong. There's nothing inferior about females. Not, oh, no, you're right. Being female makes me inferior. So therefore, I'm going to decide that, like, I can't be female and that being a woman has got nothing to do with being female because otherwise I would be inferior. Like, why the fuck are you agreeing with them? Like, you don't even seem to realize you're reproducing their logic. Like, Butler doesn't even seem to realize she's reproducing that logic. Like, you're supposedly, you've got whole groups of feminist academics deciding they're going to erase femaleness from the understanding of the definition of woman because it's essentialism. And I'm just like, no, this is just fucking internalized misogyny. Like, I'm sorry. There's no other explanation for it.
The idea that somehow difference must mean a relationship of superiority and inferiority rather than just difference, just co-be, right?
Just difference. And that we could even say that we understand that women have less upper body strength than men. And it doesn't mean that we think women are inferior in some kind of moral hierarchical political sense, right?
Right.
Most women can't arm wrestle a man.
Really not
Okay.
relevant outside of arm wrestling, you know?
Doesn't have any relationship to how much political power women should have, or whether they should be economically independent, or whether they
Right.
should be property, or whether it should be legal for men to rape them in marriage. I
Right.
mean, you know, women have better immune systems than men. Like, we never decided that that means that, like, the public sphere should be organized around the interests entirely of women. I mean, it's bonkers. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, but in the sports literature, this is very clear. Like, you cannot talk about, like, again, I think this is also one of the differences between North America and Europe. I think because of your racial history, Americans have a unusually high degree of inability to separate the concept of difference from the concept of hierarchy because of the whole separate but equal history.
Yeah. I mean, in our political tradition and in our instinctive habits, right, that we keep passing down, this sort of instinctive idea that there are classes people who deserve more than others, basically, deserve more life than others.
Right. And so, I
But
think
what
this is also why American feminism has done less well than European feminism in terms of securing, like, women's maternity rights and these types of things, right? There's certain rights claims that women have made that are based on femaleness and demands of certain accommodations that need to be made for female people to be able to, like, actively participate and be full members of public life. It has been more difficult, it seems to me, for those to be accommodated, because there seems to be this kind of instinctive thing of, like, if we admit that there is a difference, that difference will immediately be folded back into a justification for hierarchy.
well, there's that. But there's also just a really deep sort of capitalist difference. Capitalism, patriarchy's younger twin brother, right? Is that for instance, your health system is national rather than private, mostly. And
Right.
ours stayed private. Our insurance stayed private. So one of the great big lobbies against, for instance, support for maternity or even, family leave came from corporations. But at the beginning, when women in the second wave, when women were really agitating for those rights and those provisions, a lot of the resistance came from the insurance industry because it's expensive and they didn't want to have to pay for it having babies, right?
Right.
There's not a lot of money to be made in the production of children, no matter how until you get into surrogacy, which is a form of slavery. We're going to leave that for just a second. The economic forces working against women were different. The influence of the Christian right against that was also incredibly strong, right? But
Right.
again, we're talking about placing the majority of women in service to, right, or vulnerable to the power of male dominated corporations, male dominated religious structures, all of which end up serving essentially this kind of patriarchal assumption that men and their entitlement is essential, right? Any narcissistic rage response to that is obviously allowed and even to be celebrated. I mean, to the point that anytime anyone's answering a question about some batshit thing that Trump is doing, they say, well, the president has said, you know, or what the president is doing is creating strategic uncertainty. They just find a way to feed that ego
Right.
through which the egos of all of his sort of followers really are fed.
Right. And this was the thing
Mm.
with Zelensky in the Oval Office, right? This is what I found.
Yeah,
So
he didn't give it.
he wouldn't do it. And, some of the kind of geopolitical realists, I understand their position, but they were kind of like, well, Zelensky played this badly because he refused to everyone knows that you need to flatter Trump. And Zelensky should have gone in there in order to get what he wanted out of Trump, right? And he failed to do it because he wouldn't basically play this narcissistic game, right? And I think it was very, to come back to the kind of parallel again we're trying to think through with the reality denial, right? And the thing with transactivism, point at which Zelensky basically where that really went wrong is when Zelensky wouldn't go along with their narrative about how the conflict had developed and the attempt to deflect responsibility from Russia, right? So they were peddling that narrative, and Zelensky was kind of like, yes, well, but actually the truth is this is what happened. And that's when they really went off at him, right? Because
That was the first time. There was a second where it got even worse. Because he was in that room almost alone with half of the cabinet, a bunch of people who work for people there were like 15 or 20 people kind of off camera behind that couch. Reporters who were in there, and it's him and all of these Americans who are just adoring Trump right now. And the second time it went off the rails, and when it finally, I think that was when it broke down, was when somebody asked him about not wearing a suit. And I mean, he held his cool through that conversation in a way that I never would have been able to.
Yeah,
But he responded by saying, when the war is over, he says, when the war is over, then perhaps I will put on a costume. Right. The suit is a costume. And that, you could see it ripple through that room. How dare you, sort of accuse us of play acting, which of course is what they're doing. I mean, none of these people are.
There's this thing, right? I think the thing I wanted to point out is that there's a similar thing about, because what Trump is doing, I mean, Trump's a gangster, right? Let's just be honest, right? So his mode, his whole art of the deal, it's not a fucking deal, it's a fucking shakedown, right? That's what he does.
Extortion. Mm-hmm.
It's extortion, right? And extortion is about coercing people into giving things that that you are not entitled to, and making them give them to you illegitimately, right? To serve your needs. You have something that I want, I am going to force you to give it to me in illegitimate or coercive ways, right? This is exactly the same structure as what happened with the trans rights movement, right? Again, it's the same structure. And in order for that shakedown to be executed, people must not challenge the unreality of the narrative that is being used in order to frame or execute the shakedown. So in Trump's version of this, like, there is some version of the telling of the story of the Ukraine war which exculpates the fact that Russia is engaging in an act of aggression against Ukraine and Ukraine is resisting, right? And again, it's the same thing. Russia wants to take something from Ukraine, Ukraine is resisting. Trump wants to take something from Zelensky, Zelensky is resisting. The trans rights movement wants to take something from women, women are resisting, right? And that's the fundamental structure of, like, it's the fundamental structure of domination. I refuse to recognize that you are an entity with your own needs and interests, and to treat your needs and interests with respect, right? And it also shows the fundamental relationship between kind of material exploitation and that kind of mechanism of domination, right? I'm dominating you because you've got something that I want. And I want, it may be your body, it may be your identity, it may be your changing rooms, it may be the Ukraine, it may be your raw earth minerals, it may be whatever is in Greenland, like it may be
more rare earth
minerals, or like endless lashings of narcissistic supply and sycophancy. but you have a very similar structure in which you have one set of parties who just assume that their needs should be met and fuck everyone else, and everyone else should be made to comply, right? And you
Right.
know, we're materialists, you know, insofar as liberalism fails to have a full account of the nature of structural domination and pretends that we are atomized individuals who are coming at these things from similar, you know, who are free to engage in contracts or whatever, we have an issue with it, right? And that, you know, would say surrogacy or something, right? So
Mm-hmm.
we disagree with a liberal interpretation in relationship to the sex trade or surrogacy because the contractual kind of model conceals the mechanisms of structural power, right? But at least liberalism is bound for us to understand that individuals or entities have interests and they are allowed to defend them, and defending those interests is not an intolerable act of aggression, right? Whereas in patriarchy you just have, you know, any anybody that I place in the position of the subordinate, and because of the gender structure of discourse, it's particularly easy to place women in the position of the subordinate, right?
Right.
Then this refusal, there is so much like rhetorical and cultural ammunition lying around whenever men want to paint women who won't do what they want to do as heinous witches, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it just goes on and on and on and on. And it's like, we just won a Supreme Court case, right? Not because we're mean, not because we're evil, not because we're hysterical, not because we're funded by the far right, because we were right about the fucking law. Because
Yeah.
we were right that we have rights that were given to us in 1976 that you are trying to take away, and you can't have them. Sorry. And, but it's so easy, right? And it's the same thing. I mean, the thing with the Trumpians, I mean, that's slightly different is that they enjoy the domination from a much more kind of revenge triumphalist position, I think.
Yeah.
Whereas the TRAs are,
Women got into a position where they
I mean,
could determine their own lives, and the men can't handle it.
yeah, I mean, the TRAs have genuinely convinced themselves that women existing is an act of genocide. I mean, it's bonkers, but I do think they have genuinely made themselves believe this.
Have you been seeing in conversations like on Twitter after the Supreme Court ruling?
Oh, fucking Owen Jones. Fuck.
It's like you don't even have to tell the joke. You can just say the punchline. Fucking Owen Jones.
Right. Um, no, I mean, for a lot of days, it was a lot of older poor trans people. They're so upset, and endless pictures of mostly trans identified males looking very sad, and showing pictures to Rosie Duffield of trans identified males looking very sad and going, don't you feel sorry for them? Which is heinous manipulative bullshit. Like, here is this picture from this rights movement who just tried to steal your rights and spent 10 years bullying you. And now they're very sad.
I used to have a position in the party.
And now they are, what's his name? Victoria, what's his face? There's a trans identified judge, male, who wants to take us to the European Court, and he's made a little card. So having kind of, I mean, this is the whole thing. This is the Trumpian thing. This is illegitimate. The Supreme Court is illegitimate. They're all bigots. And having spent like 10 or 15 years disseminating this kind of beyond the law interpretation, which is basically we just made
Mhm.
up the law and then we're going to go and tell everybody that you have to let men into women's spaces because it's like against the law to keep them out. Now that's been clarified, what they've decided to immediately do is fall back to European law and like produce this card saying that trans people can show if someone tries to enforce the Equality Act, they will show them a card which basically threatens the person trying to enforce the Equality Act with being in violation of the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 3, Article 8, and Article 14, I believe. Article 3 is prohibition of torture. And I'm just like,
Oh.
I mean, it's also cruel and degrading or cruel and unusual punishment, right? But like, women refusing to allow men into changing rooms is not torture, right? And the degree of narcissism required to conceptualize it as such is off the fucking scale. We are literally at the level of a 3-year-old where you have to explain to a toddler that the other person exists and they might have to share the toy. And then they
Mhm.
cry and cry and cry. I mean, like, there's this story, right? Like, what is going on in our society that we have an entire class of people who literally cannot grasp that other people exist and have needs, and they are not necessarily committing an act of violence against them by refusing to give them something, because the reason they're not giving it is because they need it themselves and they're allowed to have it. And the law, the Supreme Court judgment, what I liked about it, one of the things I liked about it is that it just accepted that it was like prima facie, that the single sex exemptions were prima facie reasonable, that they had been put in the
Right.
law because it was prima facie reasonable for women to not want men in certain places. There was no re-litigation of that, right?
Right.
And after 15 years of us being told that we're fucking heinous bigots and like the only possible reason we could be saying that we don't want men in rape crisis centers is because we're trying to genocide the most vulnerable minority in the world.
Mhm.
And I'm just like, no, other people have needs. That's it. You just need to grasp that other people have needs. And that refusing to do that does not make your cause just. It makes it narcissism writ large. I'm perfectly happy to recognize that trans identified people have needs and that I think those needs should be, I think that provision should be made to meet their needs. And I
Mhm.
think it's fucking criminal that their rights movement decided that the replacement strategy was the way to get those needs met. And the only explanation of that is that the purpose of the rights movement isn't actually simply access to resources. I mean, this is why the toilet thing is now really fucking annoying. Because if all you wanted was somewhere to pee, 30 years ago, you could have set up a campaign to make sure that in public buildings, in addition to single sex toilets, there was unisex and mixed sex provision for trans identified people. But you did not do that. The entire strategy was to demand access to the legal existence and resources of the other sex. And that is because this is not just about resources to meet your needs, it is about having access to other resources as a validation of your identity, right? And turning our rape crisis centers into identity validation devices is fucking immoral. Like, so I want you to have rape crisis services when you genuinely need them. I do not want you using women's rape crisis services to validate your identities because I don't want you turning the census into an identity validation device, because that's not what
Which
it's for. And
every one of these mechanisms should feed me, should feed my need.
humans organize these things. We set up these services because they have a particular purpose. And then essentially what you've done is come along and subvert the purpose to your purpose, which is identity validation. And in the process, you have stopped them working properly for the people they were set up for.
And interestingly, all the way along, this is one of the things that has bothered me about that approach, given that building provision for yourself, for your, sort of your demographic, your identity community, there's a lot of people with money who are trans identified who could have helped support those efforts.
It's like when I was on Times Radio that day, like the woman was quite nice, but she was, bless her, she was a bit kumbaya about it. And she was like, I want everyone to come together and then she was talking to Katie John, and he was saying, like, well, it was a mistake to do the replacement strategy, right? We should have done an additive strategy. And I'm like, right. But until we actually confront why the replacement strategy was chosen over the additive strategy, we have a problem with dealing with where we are now, right? Because it's not an accident that replacement was chosen. And it's not an accident that even though we keep saying, and the EHRC is saying, trans people should not be left without provision in cases where there is single-sex services that they can't use. Everyone is screaming their head off because the additive strategy does not serve the identity validation purpose. There's a dishonesty that is going on about what the demand about access to resources is actually about. If it wasn't about that, then 30 years ago, the trans rights movement could have decided that it was going to run a set of campaigns to make sure that extra provision was provided for people who didn't feel comfortable using the facilities of the opposite sex. And they did not do that. What they did instead was construct an entire ideology in which they asserted that men or women were a gender identity and sex did not matter, and that the whole of society should be reorganized on the basis of gender identity, and then attempted to enforce that on, firstly, the Anglophone nations and most of Western and now most of the world.
The reality warping of the narcissistic formation.
This is the thing. Trans identification is inherently narcissistic in that respect, because it means that you have to make the world conform to your self-perception. And that requires, by nature, forms of at least giving instructions to people about how you are to be perceived, which is what a pronoun protocol.
Right.
A pronoun protocol is fundamentally it's like the master-slave dialectic. It's the same structure. Here is my self-image. I am going to impose my self-image on you. And if you do not accept my self-image, we're going to have a massive fight, right?
Yeah.
And then I'm going to force you to submit. And as soon as you decide that you are going to ground your sense of self on something that is not either readily perceivable or true in a material sense, that you are then going to have to control and dictate other people's perceptions, you have committed yourself to a project that is inherently narcissistic and dominating. There's no way around it.
And constantly a conflict.
It's a constant conflict. And if you are a trans-identified person and you say to yourself, I'm going to choose to identify as a woman and I'm going to give myself a name and blah, 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 but I understand that actually I'm a man and I'm not going to demand. This is why I do think there is a profound difference in the narcissistic nature between the move where you understand that you are playing something and it's not really true, and the point at which you decide it's true. And at the point at which you decide it's true, you have slipped into an inherently narcissistic position that can only lead to you trying to force other people to tell you it's true when it's not.
So this also takes me back to sort of the Trump MAGA thing, right?
Right.
Because there's this image that Trump spent years cultivating that he's a genius businessman, right?
Lol.
Right. It's untrue, right? There's nothing underneath that at all.
The shit ton of Russian oligarchs' money underneath.
He bankrupted a casino. I mean,
Yes,
you
he
pretty
did.
much have, yeah. I mean, you just can't be doing it right if you do that, right? So there's that mismatch, and it's one that he has increased and re-echoed over and over and over again, even though there's really nothing inside it but, basically fucking Bitcoin at this point. And he's good at finding illegitimate ways to scrape money out of other people, but that's not the same thing as being good at business.
Con artistry.
This is the question I want to ask you. How you wind up in a lot of trouble if you let really narcissistic people or collections of really narcissistic people lead your movement or run your politics. And so my question is kind of practical and kind of messy, but how might we sort of sniff out, as movements, the narcissists and try to give them something else to do?
It's always a problem with political movements. I mean, it's a problem wherever there is, I mean, it's also any kind of industry or field of life where there is any influence, or power, or recognition or attention knocking around in any significant quantity is going to attract narcissists. The trans rights movement is slightly different in that the trans rights movement is itself a manifestation of a way of understanding the world, which is fundamentally narcissistic. So the trans rights movement is a little bit different from what you have in a lot of political movements, where you may have a just cause, but then a lot of narcissists attach themselves to it. So that's a thing that tends to happen anyway. And then there is this kind of more fundamental thing that we're talking about, which is, when you're dealing with left identitarianism like trans activism or right identitarianism like MAGA, is that structure in and of itself fundamentally narcissistic? And then are all the people who are attached to that political cause in some sense engaging in some kind of narcissistic activity?
A lot of them.
Yeah, because with MAGA, like we said, there's some kind of narcissistic wound, right? There's some kind of narcissistic wound that has been created by, it's like all this fucking bullshit about the crisis of masculinity, right? Why is there masculinity? Because men have been told that to be male is to be dominant, is to be in a position of superiority. And they don't feel like they're in a position of superiority because there's too many women and Black and brown people and gay people running around acting like they're complete human beings. And so now they're having an identity crisis, right? In the same way that white people are apparently having an identity crisis because, European civilization is to some extent for economic reasons, largely, somewhat on the skids, because it turns out that the reason why we are in charge of the world is because we went around sucking up fucking resources from everywhere legitimately.
Murdering the shit out of anybody who resisted us.
People who wouldn't give them our shit, right?
Yeah.
Now it's like, it's because we thought we were like inherently superior.
No, just mean as fuck. Yeah.
And now there's a worldwide resource crunch. A lot of the people from the rest of the world are like, hey, you still have the resources. We would like some. And then we're like, we're being invaded by the barbarian horde.
Yeah.
Well, I think you might have created this situation. As some of my non-white friends have said to me recently, the white people are not okay, Jane. I'm like, I see the white people are not okay. And I see that, right? And it's the same thing with the crisis of masculinity, right?
The content that they need, you know, the content of their character, right? The content of their civilization. The thing that they think they're basing their identity on isn't there. We've been remarking on the Trump administration and this sort of DEI program for really mediocre white dudes.
Yeah, for really mediocre white dudes. And I mean, it's like this fucking, Jordan Peterson and his freaking like, oh, like dominance hierarchies are like actually hierarchies of competence. That's the top of the competence hierarchy. Donald Trump.
Yeah.
I mean, Donald Trump, I will give to you, is a world-class demagogue and an excellent fucking con artist, right?
Yeah. He's a
And,
traveling preacher. Yes.
and
Yeah.
snake oil salesman,
Mhm.
right?
And
Managed
revival.
to make an entire career convincing the American population somehow that he's an incredibly good businessman when he's not. He's a showman, right?
Mhm.
It's like fucking traveling. It's traveling circus shit, right? And yeah, of course, if I mean, it's very interesting. It's very Butlerian performativity, no?
Oh my God. Would you like to write an essay for Medusa Rising about the Butlerian performativity of the entire Trump MAGA
It's
construct?
the same thing. And then reality intervenes, and reality is fake news. Like the fact that Donald
Yeah.
Trump is a businessman, that he doesn't know fucking nothing about the art of the deal, that he will say something one day and everyone will go, yes, and then he'll say something the next day, whatever, that there's no internal consistency or coherence, there's no principles, like there's no principles other than the fetishization of money, status, power, and white straight man rule. Like that's it.
All of which are built, right, on the life energy and resources, or the resourcesization, right? The reification of a whole bunch of other people.
I
Right?
saw fucking Vance say something the other day about like I can't remember. He was talking about something to do with immigration, and then he started being like, I'm going to protect the land that my ancestors built with their bare hands. And I was like, no, that was the fucking slaves that built your country with their bare fucking hands.
Who said Trump said that?
No, JD Vance said this.
Oh, JD Vance. Yeah. No.
As you know, until a couple of weeks ago, I was, somewhat out of the gender war and mostly paying more attention to America and what was going on in America and was like, fucking, you know, it is different insofar as what the trans rights movement did was capture a lot of our institutions and cause democratic harms by trying to impose their agenda in an anti-democratic and reality twisting way that was also very coercive and blah blah blah. That is frightening and it has harmful consequences. It's somewhat less frightening than having an absolute fucking tyrant in the executive position in a nation who is systematically going around destroying the actual rule of law in a deliberate manner and messing up your constitution and like fucking with the separation of powers and like
Yeah.
right. So I don't want to necessarily equate them in the degree of threat that they pose to democratic,
Not the same.
not to the same degree. But the fact that they're
Mm.
in a rage here about the Supreme Court, right, is because they had captured large parts of our civil infrastructure to such a degree that they pretty much thought they were untouchable. Turns out we got to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court wasn't captured and just went, no, obviously this means biological sex, effectively. They did do that. They laid out an 86-page argument in which they explained why, if it wasn't biological sex, the entire piece of legislation would be unworkable gibberish, right?
Yeah.
But that's actually the process working properly, right? That's actually a
Mhm.
reassertion of our
Mhm.
democratic forms.
Mhm.
So I'm pleased. I'm going to
Yeah.
have to dinner soon. We've been here for 2 hours.
Okay. Yeah, almost. This kind of does get me to a question about what am I going to call it? Sort of the state of feminism here versus in the UK. I just went to go check out like all the sort of major feminist organizations like news sections on their website or their blogs to see what kinds of responses they're having or discussions they're having, at least in public, about all the shenanigans, all the wicked, evil, painful shenanigans, even just the ones that affect women, much less broader communities, and the summary deportation of children who are American citizens because their mothers are from somewhere else, right? Just fucking painful as hell. And the liberals are doing a better job of responding. The feminist, the Majority Foundation, and Ms. at least are addressing some elements of this. But like Now and Wolf and WDI USA and even Fist, sadly, don't have anything up right now.
No, I mean that American gender critical organizations are not going to resist Trump. The American gender critical organizations have decided that the resolution of the trans issue involves essentially compliance or at least silence about other aspects of Trump's agenda, which, as you know, the Radical Notion made some noise about to some considerable effect.
Yeah.
Considerable effect was not really in terms of anyone listening to us, but it did create a large bang of some time.
Right. But I think my concern right now, and especially since you're hungry, is that we're in a position right now where we've got this big tyrannical government that we're trying to resist / live through / think our way out of. And liberal organizations that are not specifically feminist are the ones that are coming through the best in terms of really confronting and organizing. There's even a group of women called Red, Wine, and Blue.
Right.
They've started at 700,000 members. Right? It has 700,000 people watching its YouTube videos and conversations. And I'm trying to imagine a way through this clusterfuck, this moment of real chaos and shaking and danger, that committed radical materialist feminists could be maybe working with those groups, having conversations with those groups that help build in better feminist directions as we come out the other side. Whether that's in a year, 10 years, the end of my lifetime. We don't have anywhere else to put our energy except to cooperate with folks who don't want to go as far as we do. But we need to try to convince them now that there's farther we could go and it could be better for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, there are conversations going on here, like within the left as well, about this, like following the Supreme Court judgment.
Yeah.
Problem
just had a win, and we are so fucked.
I mean, we're in a better situation. We still have the rise of the far right to deal with. I'm hoping that this win will actually cut off the pipeline in that direction. We have. I mean, I've been reading a lot of the Substacks and the news press and stuff, less from the left and more from the liberals, actually, because it's difficult, like we said, it's difficult to engage with the left in certain respects at the moment, because, I think we've talked about this. They're having these conversations where they're kind of going, oh, we think maybe that cancel culture thing has not been such a great idea. But they won't actually deal with the extent to which the trans ideological sex denial part was absolutely
meant canceling women.
More to why they had to engage in such a kind of moralistic and coercive way with a lot of people. Didn't come
and
out.
They won't admit that they just pissed a lot of women the fuck off.
They just pissed a lot of women off, and they're not all white middle class wine mums and Karens, right?
No, they're not.
Just what absolutely deep misogynist dismissal of women over the age of 35 for complaining. Buckle.
No, but it was it's across demographics.
The liberals, with respect to you would fucking hope that at this point liberals would turn up and be like, actually, you're destroying the rule of law. This is a bit of a problem. I mean, there have been other liberals over here, Helen Pluckrose, Claire Lehman, the Quillette woman, right?
Mm-hmm.
Quillette because of, right-wing culture warrior positioning or whatever. She came out at the point where the deportation started and the judge demanded that they were stopped and they didn't. She came straight out the fucking gate, absolutely intransigent about this, like really
Yeah.
impressive. Like,
Yeah.
you don't seem to understand that the purpose of due process is to protect you.
Yeah.
She
And
got a lot.
Applebaum at the
And
Atlantic, a whole bunch of.
I really like the kind of anti-wokes who are refusing to understand that they're dealing with right-wing quasi-fascist authoritarianism at this point. Even fucking James Lindsay has fucking recanted at this point, which is insane.
Yeah.
Eh?
Yeah.
He came out the other.
Our equivalent of that is Bill Crystal. Bill Crystal is like, shit, this is not okay.
James Lindsay was like, I got used by the fascists. I'm sorry. I kind of knew they were using me. I was like, fucking hell, what is happening now? I mean, Anne Applebaum is not a freaking wokist. I mean, she's a center-right neocon. Like,
and she is like, we are in the deep shit now.
she's like,
yeah, I mean, I'm really, yes, everybody stop cooperating. Yeah, it's bubbling, and it really is coming more from the sort of, center right, it's been, I'm asking you this because it's the series I've been writing for Medusa Rising has been like, what do we do, radical materialist feminists, about the fact that we are confronting fascism directly? Both in terms of how do we frame this, how do we look at these discourses, but also in who do we work with?
Well, I think there's different questions here.
I've been trying to answer them.
My general principle is that when you are confronting fascism, you work with everyone who is against the fascists, right?
Right.
So I think I've been having arguments with people about this. I mean, also with respect to issues around Ukraine and, the kind of hanky anti-imperialist part of the left that is kind of, oh, this is all European imperialist warmongering and blah, 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 and like whatever else. And I'm just like, well, at this point, Trump and Putin and right-wing populism have all lined up with each other. So
they're all aiming at you. Yeah.
my position is that we're against them. And I'm not very tribal by nature. And this is one of the things that played out kind of in the GCs. I am not very tribal by nature, but I do believe that you need to have a really, really fucking clear line with fascists. And the extent to which trans activism's misuse of the social consensus around that hard line against fascism in order to try and railroad through a load of sex denialist bullshit has caused enormous harm, because now we have actual fascists to deal with. And I will stand with any motherfucker. I will stand with the frickin' Telegraph or the Daily Mail or neoliberals or the European Union or Anne fucking Applebaum or fucking anyone against fascists.
Yeah.
And I will not be that fussy about it. I will stand with the TRAs against fascists. Right?
Absolutely.
I will stand with anyone.
Absolutely. They're coming for those guys.
The amount of effort that some people put into attempting to explain my apparent deep aversion to fascism, when really I'm just deeply averse to fascism. And I don't think it requires much further explanation. So there's one question, which is who do we stand with? And I'm like, everyone who's standing against the fascists. That's it. Then there's another question, which is, can we do that given the bitterness of the conflicts? Particularly, I mean, there's a lot of conversation going on Facebook among my like materialist leftist kind of comrades who are, I never ever actually got that. I've always been more theoretical. I never actually got that involved in the nitty gritty of like left wing because it's just a lot of splintering and pain. But they are doing good work, kind of trying to say, look, guys, I know we had this massive fallout about the whole men and women thing. Well, fascism now. So can we please attempt to realize that was probably a really bad road for us to go down and right together now. I am hoping that some portions of the left can be prevailed upon to realize they went down anti-materialist and actually fundamentally idealist, individualist, neoliberal identity project. And yes, of course, trans-identified people should be protected and their rights should be protected. But this whole messianic mind-body salvation story, and we are going to place the interest, like we are going to use these people's interests as the totem of injustice in the world.
Mm.
Because then to come back to the domination thing, right? It becomes very, these people become the totem of effectively the wretched of the earth. It's a religious structure, right?
Right.
And then all you have to do to save them is believe they are who they say they are. So it doesn't actually require any material transformation at all. It just requires your belief. It's such fundamental religious structure. And if you believe, then they will be saved.
Everything else can stay the same.
In their mind, these, because it's like a keystone, right? In the structure, the oppression of trans-identified people, the oppression of trans people becomes like the lodestone of the entire arch of structural oppression. So somehow, if we save them, then the whole of white cis hetero patriarchy, blah, 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 is going to collapse.
And
all you have to do is believe them. Can you imagine? We can undo.
If it would work, I would do it.
We can undo thousands of years of structural oppression, and all we have to do is believe that men can turn into women. I mean, wow, what a deal. What an absolute arsehole you must be for refusing to do it. Like, Jesus is going to fucking save you, and you keep saying that you don't believe he was resurrected. Why? You must be a devil worshiper.
Yeah. I think because the situation we're in over here is so much more immediate and dire that the order of events is first we get rid of the fascists, then we have the conversation about these sort of theoretical ideal structures of our way of thinking. Don't start with the conversation. You have
to grab fucking everybody. You have to grab everyone. And if the insane lunatic, like super woke fringe insists on just, I mean, this is what's really fucking me off at the moment. It's like you are still actually more interested in using the threat of fascism to discipline a bunch of middle-aged women into accepting your bullshit about clownfish than you are in us coming together to defeat the actual fascists. And from this, I conclude that you're not actually that scared of fucking fascism. Cut this crap out now.
Who are trying to suspend the First, Fourth, and 14th Amendments as quickly as they possibly can.
The stakes are really fucking high. It's like the Democrats and that sports bill the other day. Like, when are you going to understand that people are not going to buy this bullshit? And the stakes are very, very fucking high right now.
I don't know.
Right. Well, maybe we should end that.
I don't think we're not going to be able to wait for them. I mean, I think.
No. Everyone needs to act in accordance with their own beliefs, right? And conscience. And when these moments happen, there isn't time to be too fussy in terms of making everyone line up on a whole slate of proposals.
And I think there's also there's just a possibility that going through this confrontation with real despotic, no shit, letting ICE walk into your house with no warrant, no shit, that might have a burnishing effect on these left movements. It might bring us into some clarity about our priorities, about our methods, about how we talk to people, but also how we work with each other.
Well,
enemies amongst each other is not going to help us.
I mean, but this is what I find disheartening about the conversation about cancel culture, like swerving the core issue, because it's like, it's clear that they understand they've made a mistake and they're prepared. Most of the kind of hip online left are basically like, oh, woke is over. Like, cancel culture went too far, blah, 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 blah. But they will still
Not admit.
not admit, like we said, that trans activism was absolutely core to it. And then it's not just they went too far, they tried to enforce a idealist, reality denying lie on the whole of society. And they did it through coercion, gaslighting. And it's not just
And
that they went
stomp
around
the fuck out of any woman who said no.
and bullied the fuck out of any woman that said no and went around fucking terrorizing people. And it's not just
Mhm.
bullied people on Twitter, right? People lost their
No.
jobs. People lost their livelihoods. Like, people lost their entire friendship groups. I know hundreds of women who were kicked out of their lives
Mhm.
for refusing to go along with it.
Mhm.
And that is not an operation of justice. If that's how you need to behave in order to enforce your political program, then something's wrong with it. And
Right.
you need to have a serious fucking word with yourself about how you ended up behaving like that, because you have given an enormous amount of energy and ammunition to the rise of the far right. I'm not saying you caused it, but by the law of reaction and counter reaction, you have fed it. And now that it's here, you are still more interested in using that threat in order to make women stay in line than you are in going, okay, all right, right, we know that was bullshit. Sorry about that, right? Like, let's deal with these fascists, which is what we actually need to do, right?
Yeah.
I have to go and eat a cheese sandwich.
Yes, thank you.
Otherwise, I would.
Thanks. It has been wonderful for me to have this time to just hang out with you and talk about the things. We haven't had a chance to do this in a long time.
I know.
So,
I was very, very tired for a while. I was very tired.
yeah.
So I've had a little bit of time to rejuvenate. So
Mhm.
onwards,
Yeah.
onwards,
Yeah.
maybe sideways.
A little. Yes. But nonetheless, we have
Good.
to get through and quickly over here, or it's going to be a very long time.
Yes.
But
Okay.
yes, thanks, Jane. Yeah. Good to have your face. Good
Lovely
to
to see
see
you.
you. Good
Peace.
luck with all the things. I hope everybody signs up for the school
Yeah.
and learns a lot and has the pleasure of also hanging out with you and having these genius conversations.
This is
That would
fun.
be great. All right.
We'll see you
Okay.
soon.
See you soon. Bye.
Bye.